Miriam had never seen anything like the Johnson mansion in her entire life. The gate alone was bigger than her family's entire house back in the village. She stood for a moment, clutching her small bag of clothes, staring at the large iron bars. Beyond them, a long driveway lined with flowers led to a house so big it looked like something out of a dream or a storybook. Her heart raced. She hadn't wanted to take this job, but what choice did she have? With her mother sick and her younger siblings to feed, Miriam had to work. She needed the money, but as she walked through the gates, her stomach churned. She didn't belong here. Everything about this place screamed rich, and she was anything but. A uniformed man opened the front door for her, barely glancing at her as he gestured her inside. The floor was shiny, like glass, and Miriam hesitated before stepping on it. She was scared her shoes would leave marks. The ceiling stretched so high above her that she felt dizzy just looking up. "Are you the new girl?" A sharp voice snapped. Miriam flinched and turned to see a tall woman in a sleek, fitted dress standing at the bottom of a wide staircase. She was beautiful, with perfect makeup and hair tied back neatly, but the way she looked at Miriam made her feel small, like a speck of dust on the shiny floor. "Yes, Ma," Miriam said quietly, clutching her bag tighter. "I'm Madame Folake," the woman said, her lips tight. "You'll call me ma'am. Speak only when spoken to, and stay out of my way. Do your work properly, or you'll be out of here faster than you can say goodbye." "Yes, ma'am," Miriam said again, bowing her head. Her face burned with shame, but she didn't say anything else. Folake glanced at Miriam's bag and sighed loudly, as if annoyed by her very existence. "Martha will show you to the staff quarters," she said, waving her hand like she was shooing a fly. Then, without another word, she turned and walked up the stairs, her heels clicking loudly against the marble. Miriam let out a shaky breath. This was going to be harder than she thought. Martha, an older woman with kind eyes, led Miriam to a small room at the back of the house. It was plain, with just a bed, a table, and a tiny cupboard, but it was clean and quiet. "This will be your space," Martha said. "The other staff members are friendly, but don't get too comfortable. Madame Folake doesn't like it when the maids get too close." Miriam nodded, placing her bag on the bed. "Thank you, Ma." Martha smiled faintly. "Call me Martha, and don't worry too much about Madame. Just keep your head down and work hard." Miriam nodded again, but inside, she wasn't so sure. Folake's sharp eyes and cold voice were already burned into her memory. She wasn't sure how she was going to survive here. The next morning, Miriam began her duties. She cleaned the enormous living room, polished the glass furniture, and arranged the books on the shelves. She was careful to do everything perfectly, but her hands still trembled as she worked. Every time she heard footsteps, she froze, terrified that Madame Folake would appear. As Miriam dusted a shelf, her eyes fell on a framed photograph. It showed a young woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile. Something about her face felt familiar, though Miriam couldn't place why. She picked up the photo to look more closely, but her thoughts were interrupted by a deep voice behind her. "Who said you could touch that?" Miriam jumped, nearly dropping the frame. She turned to see a tall man standing in the doorway. He was older, with gray streaks in his hair, but his sharp features and piercing eyes made him look powerful. He wore a dark suit, and everything about him, from the way he stood to the way he stared at her, demanded respect. "I'm sorry, sir," Miriam stammered, quickly setting the photo back on the shelf. "I was just cleaning." The man stepped into the room, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. "You're the new maid?" "Yes, sir," Miriam said, lowering her gaze. "What's your name?" he asked. "Miriam, sir." He was silent for a moment, studying her. Miriam felt like he could see right through her, and it made her skin crawl. Finally, he said, "Stay out of trouble, Miriam." "Yes, sir," she whispered, barely able to meet his eyes. He walked past her and stopped in front of the shelf, his hand brushing the photo she'd been looking at. For a moment, his hard expression softened, and Miriam thought she saw something like sadness in his eyes. But just as quickly, his face hardened again, and he turned to leave without another word. As soon as he was gone, Miriam let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She leaned against the shelf, her hands shaking. Who was he? And why had he looked at her like that? Over the next few days, Miriam noticed the man, Untill Johnson, watching her. He never said much, but his eyes followed her whenever she was in the same room. It made her uneasy. Did he know something about her? Did he suspect something? She shook her head. That was impossible. He couldn't know. Still, every time their eyes met, Miriam felt a strange pull, like there was something connecting them. It wasn't fear exactly, but it wasn't comfort either. She tried to ignore it and focus on her work, but it wasn't easy. One afternoon, while Miriam was cleaning the study, Untill walked in unexpectedly. She quickly stepped aside, clutching her cleaning cloth, unsure of what to do. "You don't have to act like I'm going to bite you," he said, sitting down at the large desk. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Miriam uneasy. I'm just doing my work, sir," she said, staring at the floor. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, watching her. "How old are you?" he asked suddenly. Miriam blinked, surprised by the question. 22, sir." He nodded slowly, as if the answer confirmed something. "Where are you from?" "A small village, sir. Near Osogbo." Untill's expression didn't change, but Miriam thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "What's your mother's name?" he asked. Her heart skipped a beat. Why was he asking about her mother? "Saad, sir," she said quietly. For a moment, Untill said nothing. Then he stood and walked to the window, his back to her. "You can go," he said, his voice flat. Miriam didn't wait to be told twice. She quickly gathered her things and left the room, her mind racing. Why had he asked about her mother? Did he know her? No, that couldn't be it. He was probably just curious. But the look in his eyes haunted her. It was like he was trying to piece something together, just like she was. Later that evening, Miriam sat in her small room, holding a worn envelope. It was the letter her mother had written before she passed away. Miriam had read it 100 times, but she opened it again, as if hoping to find something she'd missed. "Miriam, my sweet girl," the letter began. "You are stronger than you know. One day you will find the truth about your father. He is a powerful man, but don't let his power scare you. He has his faults, but I believe deep down he has a good heart. I hope you will forgive him, even if he doesn't deserve it." Miriam's eyes filled with tears as she read the words. She didn't know what to feel. Her mother had kept so many secrets, and now, those secrets were following her into this house. What would she do if she found out the truth? And what would Untill Johnson do if he ever found out who she really was? As she lay down to sleep, Miriam couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. Miriam woke up to the faint sound of footsteps outside her room. She blinked, rubbing her eyes. The small clock on the table read 5:30 a.m. It was earlier than she had planned to get up, but she couldn't shake the unease that had been with her since yesterday. Untill Johnson's questions about her mother had unsettled her deeply. She sat up and stared at the folded letter on her bedside table, her mother's words echoing in her mind. "One day, you will find the truth about your father. Why now? Why here? Could it really be true?" She shook her head. It wasn't possible. Someone like him couldn't be her father. The thought was ridiculous. Still, the way he had looked at her, it wasn't just curiosity. It was as though he was searching for something in her face. Connection. Miriam sighed and swung her legs off the bed. She had work to do. Whatever was bothering Untill, it was none of her business. She was here to work, nothing more. By mid-morning, the household was in full swing. Madame Folake had called a meeting with the staff in the kitchen, her sharp voice cutting through the air like a knife. Miriam stood in the back, trying to stay invisible as Folake gave instructions. "I don't want any mistakes," Folake snapped, glaring at everyone. "There's an important dinner party tonight, and everything must be perfect. The governor's wife will be here. If anyone embarrasses me, they will be out of this house before the night is over. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," the staff chorused, though their faces were tense. Miriam kept her eyes on the floor, praying she wouldn't do anything to attract attention. Folake's glare passed over her but lingered for a moment, as if she were already preparing to find fault with her. "Get to work," Folake said sharply, turning on her heel and leaving the room. The moment she was gone, the tension in the air eased slightly, and the staff began murmuring among themselves. Miriam was about to leave when Martha, the older maid, touched her arm. "Be careful today," Martha whispered. "Madam is in a bad mood. Don't give her any reason to notice you." Miriam nodded, grateful for the warning. She knew Folake didn't like her, but today, she would make herself invisible if she had to. As Miriam worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced over her shoulder a few times but saw nothing. Still, the feeling persisted, making her hands tremble as she polished the silverware for the evening. She was halfway through her tasks when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Uncle Deji standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and a sly smile on his face. He was tall and thin, with a sharpness in his features that made Miriam uneasy. "You're the new girl, aren't you?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes cold. "Yes, sir," Miriam said, lowering her gaze. Uncle Deji walked closer, his shoes clicking against the tile floor. "Miriam, right?" She nodded. He said, studying her face. "You remind me of someone." Miriam's heart skipped a beat. She forced herself to keep her expression calm, but her hands tightened on the cloth she was holding. "I don't know who that could be, sir." "Oh, I think you do," he said, his smile widening. "Tell me, where are you from?" "Osun State, sir," she said quietly. "Osun State," he repeated, as if the words tasted strange in his mouth. "Interesting. And your mother? What's her name?" Miriam hesitated. Why did everyone keep asking about her mother? "Saad, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Uncle Deji's smile faded slightly. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "Saad," he said slowly. "I see." Miriam felt like she was standing on thin ice. She didn't know why, but it felt like Uncle Deji was trying to trap her. "If there's nothing else, sir, I should get back to work," she said, trying to sound polite but firm. He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a cigarette, lighting it with a flick of his lighter. He took a long drag, his eyes never leaving her face. "You're a hard worker, aren't you, Miriam?" he said finally. "Yes, sir." "Good," he said, blowing out a cloud of smoke. "Keep it that way, and stay out of trouble." "Yes, sir," she said again, her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. Uncle Deji gave her one last lingering look before turning and walking away, the faint smell of smoke trailing behind him. Miriam let out a shaky breath and sank into a chair, her legs trembling. What was he trying to do? And why did his questions feel so dangerous? That evening, as Miriam prepared to clear the dining room, she overheard a heated argument coming from the study. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear Adilu and Uncle Deji's voices, low but tense. "She's just a maid," Adilu was saying, his tone sharp. "Why are you so interested in her?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Uncle Deji replied. "Don't you think it's strange? A girl like that, from Osun State? Her mother's name is Saad." There was a long pause. Miriam held her breath, her hand gripping the edge of the doorframe. "What are you trying to say, Deji?" Adilu asked, his voice cold. "I'm saying you should think carefully," Uncle Deji said. "She might not be here by accident." "You're paranoid," Adilu snapped. "You always have been." "Maybe," Uncle Deji said, his voice calm. "But maybe you should look into her, just in case." Miriam stepped back quickly, her heart racing. She couldn't hear any more. Whatever they were talking about, it couldn't be good. She hurried away, her mind spinning. Why were they talking about her? What did they know? The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Miriam tried to stay focused on her work, but her thoughts kept returning to the conversation she'd overheard. She couldn't shake the feeling that her time in the Johnson mansion was running out. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Miriam clutched her mother's letter tightly in her hands. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was clear. The truth about her father was closer than she had ever imagined, and it terrified her. Miriam couldn't sleep. Her small room felt too quiet, but her mind was anything but. Uncle Deji's questions, the tension between him and Adilu, and her own worries swirled around her head like a storm. She sat up and stared at the folded letter from her mother, her fingers trembling. Why was her life suddenly so complicated? She came here to work, to earn money for her family. Now it felt like there was something much bigger at play, something she didn't fully understand. Her mother's words from the letter haunted her. One day, you will find the truth about your father. Miriam didn't want to find it. She didn't even know if she was ready for it. But the way things were unfolding, it seemed like the truth was determined to find her. The next day, Miriam kept her head down as she went about her tasks, but she could feel the tension in the house. Uncle Deji was watching her more closely than ever, and Adilu's presence seemed heavier, like a storm cloud hanging over her. As she dusted the shelves in the grand library, her hand brushed against a leather-bound book. Something slipped out, a photograph. Miriam bent down to pick it up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw what it was. It was an old picture of a much younger Adilu, smiling next to a woman who looked so familiar it made Miriam's chest tighten. She didn't need to guess who the woman was. The gentle eyes, the shy smile. It was her mother. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. Why was this photo here? Did this mean her mother and Adilu really knew each other? Before she could process what she was seeing, a voice behind her made her freeze. Why are you looking at that? Miriam spun around, clutching the photo to her chest. Uncle Deji was standing in the doorway, his sharp eyes narrowed on her. I didn't mean to, Miriam stammered. It just fell out of the book. Uncle Deji's gaze dropped to the photograph in her hands, and his expression shifted. For a moment, he didn't speak, but when he did, his voice was low and dangerous. Give that to me, he said, holding out his hand. Miriam hesitated. It's not mine, she said quietly. I just found it. I said give it to me, Uncle Deji snapped, his voice rising. Miriam flinched and handed him the photo. He snatched it from her and stared at it, his jaw tightening. Where did you find this? He demanded. In that book, Miriam said, pointing to the shelf. I didn't mean to. Quiet, Uncle Deji cut her off. He studied the photo for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket. Then he turned back to Miriam, his eyes cold. You need to be careful, he said. You're poking around in things you don't understand. I wasn't poking around, Miriam protested, her voice shaking. I was just cleaning. Cleaning, he repeated, his tone mocking. Do you think I don't know what you're doing? You're trying to dig up the past, aren't you? Miriam shook her head quickly. No, sir. Promise. Uncle Deji stepped closer, towering over her. Listen to me, he said, his voice low and threatening. Stay out of it. Do your work, keep your mouth shut, and don't think for a second that you're smarter than you are. Miriam swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, sir. Uncle Deji stared at her for another moment before walking away, his footsteps echoing down the hall. As soon as he was gone, Miriam sank to the floor, her hands trembling. What was she supposed to do now? The photo was proof that her mother and Adilu had a connection. But what kind of connection? And why was Uncle Deji so desperate to hide it? Later that evening, Miriam decided to confront Martha. She found the older maid in the kitchen, preparing a tray of tea. Martha, Miriam said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. Can I ask you something? Martha looked up, her expression kind but cautious. What is it, dear? Do you know anything about Mr. Adilu and a woman named Saad? Miriam asked. Martha's hands paused over the tray, and for a moment, she didn't speak. Then she sighed and looked at Miriam closely. Why do you ask? Martha said, her voice soft. Miriam hesitated, unsure of how much to say. I think they might have known each other. Martha set down the tray and folded her arms. There are things in this house that are better left alone, she said. Sometimes, digging into the past only brings trouble. I'm not trying to cause trouble, Miriam said quickly. I just want to know the truth. Martha studied her for a long moment before sighing again. I don't know much, she admitted. But I do know that years ago, Mr. Adilu spent some time in Osun State. He didn't talk about it much, but I heard whispers from the staff. Something happened there, but no one knows what. Miriam's heart sank. That wasn't enough. It only confirmed what she already suspected. Do you think? Miriam's voice trailed off. She wasn't sure how to finish the question. Be careful, Miriam, Martha said gently. The truth can be heavy. Make sure you're ready for it before you go looking. That night, Miriam lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was racing. The photograph, Uncle Deji's threats, Martha's warning. They all pointed to one thing. Her mother's letter was right. There was a truth here, and it was tied to Adilu Johnson. But what was she supposed to do? She couldn't confront him, not without proof. And even if she had proof, what then? Would he even care? As the hours ticked by, Miriam felt the weight of her mother's words more than ever. He has his faults, but I believe deep down he has a good heart. Miriam wasn't sure if she believed that yet, but one thing was certain. The answers she was looking for were closer than ever, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face them. Miriam stood outside the study door, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure anyone nearby could hear it. She had thought about this moment all night, turning it over and over in her mind until she felt like she would burst if she didn't act. The photograph, the questions about her mother, Uncle Deji's threats, it all pointed to one thing. She had to confront Mr. Adilu. But now that she was standing here, her courage felt like it was slipping away. She clenched her fists tightly, trying to steady her nerves. You can do this, Miriam. You have to. Before she could lose her nerve, she raised her hand and knocked on the heavy wooden door. Come in, came Adilu's voice, calm and commanding as always. Miriam pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. Adilu was seated at his desk, looking over some papers. He didn't look up immediately, but when he did, his eyes narrowed slightly, as if surprised to see her. What do you want? He asked, his tone sharp but not unkind. Miriam swallowed hard. I need to talk to you, sir. Adilu leaned back in his chair, studying her with those piercing eyes that always seemed to see more than she wanted them to. About what? She hesitated for a moment, her hands trembling slightly. Then she took a deep breath and pulled the letter from her mother out of her pocket. It's about my mother, she said quietly. Adilu's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered to the letter in her hand. Your mother, he repeated. What does she have to do with me? Miriam stepped closer, her voice shaking but steady enough to be heard. Her name was Saad, she said. She knew you, and I think you knew her too. There was a long silence. Adilu's face remained unreadable, but Miriam thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition? Maybe? Or guilt. He didn't deny it, and that alone made her stomach twist. Why are you telling me this? He said finally, his voice quieter now. Miriam held up the letter. Before she died, my mother wrote this. She told me my father was a powerful man, someone who left her behind when she needed him most. And I think that man is you. Adilu's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. He stood up slowly, walking over to the window, his back to her. You think I'm your father, he said flatly, almost like he was testing the words. Miriam's heart was racing. I don't know for sure, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But everything points to you. The photo I found, the way you've been looking at me. I just need to know the truth. Adilu turned around suddenly, his face a mixture of anger and something else she couldn't quite place. Do you have any idea what you're saying? He demanded. You're accusing me of abandoning your mother, of leaving a child behind. Do you think that's something I would just forget? Miriam flinched but held her ground. I'm not accusing you, sir, she said firmly. I just want answers. If you're not my father, then say so. But if you are, her voice broke slightly, and she looked down at the floor. If you are, I deserve to know. Adilu stared at her for what felt like an eternity. Then he sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. Your mother, he said slowly. Her name was Saad. She was from Osun State. Miriam nodded quickly. Yes. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to block out a memory. I met her a long time ago, he admitted, his voice quiet now. I was young and reckless, and I didn't think about the consequences of my actions. She was special. But I left. I had to. My family had plans for me, and I couldn't stay. Miriam felt a lump rise in her throat. She was pregnant when you left, she said softly. She never told you, did she? Adilu's eyes snapped open, and for the first time, Miriam saw real shock on his face. Pregnant, he said, his voice barely audible. Miriam nodded. She raised me on her own, she said. She never told me who my father was until the very end. She didn't want me to grow up hating him. Adilu sank into his chair, his face pale. I didn't know, he said, almost to himself. I didn't know she was pregnant. Miriam took a step closer, her hands trembling. You left her, but she never hated you, she said. She believed you had a good heart. She believed you would have done the right thing if you'd known. Adilu looked up at her, his eyes filled with something Miriam couldn't quite name. I don't know what to say, he admitted. If what you're saying is true, then I failed her. I failed you. The room fell silent, the weight of the truth hanging heavy in the air. Miriam's chest felt tight, but she forced herself to speak. I'm not here to blame you, she said quietly. I just wanted to know. I needed to know. Adilu nodded slowly, his face still pale. You've been through so much, he said. And I don't even know where to begin. Before Miriam could respond, the door burst open, and Madame Folake stormed in. Her eyes immediately locked onto Miriam, and her face twisted in fury. What is going on here? She demanded, her voice like a whip. What are you doing in my husband's study? Miriam stepped back instinctively, her heart pounding. Adilu stood up quickly, his expression hardening. Folake, this isn't... I don't want to hear it. Folake snapped, cutting him off. She turned on Miriam, her eyes blazing. How dare you come in here and disturb my husband? What lies have you been telling him? They're not lies, Miriam said, her voice shaking. Quiet, Folake shouted. She turned to Adilu, her hands on her hips. What has this girl been saying? What kind of nonsense is this? Adilu hesitated for a moment, then sighed heavily. Folake, please calm down. This is important. Important, Folake repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. What could possibly be important about this maid? She's nothing. She's here to clean, not to make up stories. Enough! Adilu's voice thundered through the room, silencing both women. He turned to Folake, his expression stern. This is not nonsense. This is about my past, and it's something I need to deal with. Folake's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She stared at him, her face pale with shock. Your past, she said finally. What are you talking about? Adilu glanced at Miriam, then back at his wife. Miriam might be my daughter, he said simply. The words hung in the air like a bomb, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Folake let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Your daughter, she said, her voice rising. Are you serious? Do you expect me to believe this? It's the truth, Miriam said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. My mother was Saad. She knew him, and I think he's my father. Folake turned on Miriam, her face a mask of fury. You think, she spat. You think? You have no proof, no evidence, and you dare to come in here and make these claims? Who put you up to this? Is this some kind of scam? It's not a scam, Miriam said firmly. I don't want anything from him. I just wanted the truth. Folake laughed again, a harsh, bitter sound. The truth? The truth is that you're a liar. And if you think I'm going to let you stay in this house, you're wrong. Folake. Stop, Adilu said, his voice firm. This is not the time for accusations. It's exactly the time. Folake snapped. Do you know what this will do to us? To our reputation? To our family? You can't just accept this girl's story without proof. Adilu sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. We'll get proof, he said. But until then, Miriam stays. What? Folake's voice rose to a near scream. You're choosing her over me? Over your family? I'm not choosing anyone, Adilu said tiredly. I'm trying to do what's right. Miriam stood silently, watching the argument unfold. She felt small, like a child caught in the middle of a fight between parents. But she also felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, she felt like someone was standing up for her. As the argument continued, Miriam slipped out of the room, her heart heavy but her steps steady. The truth was out now, and there was no turning back. All she could do was wait and see what would happen next. The mansion was quieter than usual the next morning, but the silence was heavy, like the air before a storm. Miriam had stayed in her small room all night, her heart heavy with everything that had happened. Madame Folake's furious words echoed in her mind. She didn't regret speaking the truth, but the weight of it felt unbearable. She knew she couldn't hide forever. She had to face whatever was coming. But as she stepped into the long hallway leading to the kitchen, she froze. Madame Folake was standing near the dining room, speaking in hushed tones with Uncle Deji. The moment their eyes met, Folake's face darkened. "Miriam!" Folake's sharp voice cut through the silence. "Come here. Now!" Miriam hesitated but forced her legs to move. She approached slowly, keeping her head down, but she could feel Uncle Deji's cold stare boring into her. "Yes, ma'am," Miriam said softly, her voice barely audible. Folake stepped closer, her eyes blazing with anger. "Do you think you're clever?" she hissed. "Do you think you can just walk into this house, throw around wild accusations, and get away with it?" Miriam lifted her head slightly, meeting Folake's gaze. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said. "I just wanted the truth." "The truth?" Folake snapped, her voice rising. "You don't even know what the truth is. You're just a maid, a nobody. And now you've turned my home upside down with your lies." "They're not lies," Miriam said firmly, though her voice shook. "I didn't come here to hurt anyone. I just wanted to know where I came from." Uncle Deji stepped forward, his expression calm but menacing. "You've caused enough damage," he said, his voice low. "You're a distraction, a problem that needs to be solved. And trust me, I know how to solve problems." Miriam's stomach twisted. She didn't know what he meant, but his tone sent chills down her spine. "I don't want to cause any more trouble," she said, trying to stay calm. "I just want to talk to Mr. Adilu again." "You will do no such thing," Folake shouted, her face red with anger. "Adilu is my husband, not some toy for you to manipulate. If you think I'll let you ruin everything we've built, you're more foolish than I thought." "Folake, that's enough." The voice was calm but firm, and it made everyone turn. Adilu stood at the end of the hallway, his expression unreadable. He walked toward them slowly, his eyes fixed on his wife. "Enough of this," he said again, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Miriam, come with me." Folake's mouth fell open, but no words came out. Uncle Deji raised an eyebrow, but he said nothing. Miriam hesitated, glancing at Folake and Deji before stepping forward. Adilu turned and began walking, and she followed him silently. Adilu led Miriam to his study and closed the door behind them. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I'm sorry about Folake," Adilu said after a moment. "She isn't handling this well." "I understand," Miriam said quietly. "I didn't mean to upset her." Adilu nodded, leaning against his desk. He looked tired, older than he had the day before. "This isn't easy for any of us," he admitted. "But I need to know why now. Why did you come here of all places?" Miriam hesitated, unsure of how to explain. "I didn't know you lived here," she said finally. "I just needed a job. My mother was sick, and we didn't have money. This was supposed to help my family." Adilu's expression softened slightly. "And your mother? She never told you about me until the end?" Miriam shook her head. "She didn't want me to grow up hating you," she said. "She said you had your reasons for leaving." Adilu let out a heavy sigh and ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't know," he said again, almost to himself. "If I had known, things might have been different." "Would they?" Miriam asked, her voice trembling. "Would you have come back? Would you have helped her?" Adilu looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and sadness. "I'd like to think I would have," he said, "but I can't change the past. All I can do now is try to make things right." Miriam stared at him, her emotions swirling. She wanted to believe him, but the years of pain and struggle her mother had endured were hard to forget. The sound of the study door opening made them both turn. Folake stood in the doorway, her face a mask of fury. "You're not seriously entertaining this, are you?" she demanded, glaring at Adilu. "This girl is trying to destroy us, and you're just talking to her?" "Folake," Adilu said calmly, though there was an edge to his voice. "This isn't about you or me. This is about the truth." "The truth?" Folake laughed bitterly. "The truth is that she's lying. She's trying to take advantage of you, and you're letting her—" "She's not lying," Adilu said firmly. "And you need to stop treating her like she doesn't matter." Folake's face turned red. "I won't let this girl ruin our family," she said through gritted teeth. "If you care about us, you'll send her away." Miriam stood silently, watching the argument unfold. She felt like an intruder, but she also felt a strange sense of strength. She wasn't here to hurt anyone, but she wasn't going to let them push her out without hearing her side. "This isn't about ruining the family," Adilu said, his voice steady. "It's about taking responsibility for the mistakes I've made." "Mistakes?" Folake repeated, her voice rising. "You mean her? You're calling her a mistake?" "No," Adilu said sharply. "I'm calling my actions a mistake. Leaving her mother, not knowing the truth, that was my mistake. And now I'm trying to fix it." Folake's hands clenched into fists, but she didn't reply. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, she turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Adilu let out a long breath and sat down heavily in his chair. "I'm sorry," he said, looking at Miriam. "She's angry, but she'll calm down." Miriam nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. "What happens now?" she asked hesitantly. Adilu met her gaze, his expression serious. "We'll get a DNA test," he said. "That way there's no doubt. And if it confirms what we already know, then we'll figure out what comes next." Miriam nodded again, her chest tight with emotion. "Thank you," she said softly. Adilu gave her a faint smile. "You're my daughter," he said simply. "It's the least I can do." For the first time, Miriam felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but at least she wasn't walking it alone anymore. The days that followed felt like a storm had settled over the mansion. Everyone seemed to walk on eggshells. Miriam tried her best to stay out of sight, doing her work quietly and avoiding Madame Folake and Uncle Deji. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the tension that followed her everywhere. The DNA test had been done. Now all she could do was wait. And while she waited, the whispers around her grew louder. The other staff looked at her differently now, some with pity, others with suspicion. It felt like every eye in the house was watching her, waiting for her to slip up. It was on the third morning after the test that Miriam's world was shaken again. She was polishing the silver in the dining room when Uncle Deji strode in, his expression dark and determined. He closed the door behind him, and Miriam immediately felt a chill run down her spine. "Good morning, sir," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Uncle Deji didn't respond. He walked over to her and stood so close that she could smell the faint scent of his cologne. His eyes bore into hers, cold and calculating. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said finally, his voice low and sharp. Miriam blinked, confused. "I don't know what you mean, sir." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Don't play innocent with me, girl. I know exactly what you're doing. You're trying to worm your way into this family. But let me tell you something. You don't belong here." Miriam straightened her back, her hands gripping the cloth tightly. "I'm not trying to take anything from anyone," she said firmly. "I just want the truth." "The truth?" Deji sneered. "The truth is you're a nobody. And if you think a DNA test is going to change that, you're delusional." Miriam's chest tightened, but she refused to back down. "I didn't ask to be here," she said. "I didn't ask for any of this. All I want is to know who I am. And you think that gives you the right to disrupt everything?" Deji shot back. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to Adilu? To Folake? To the entire family?" Miriam felt a surge of anger. "I didn't create this situation," she said, her voice rising. If you're looking for someone to blame, blame him. He's the one who left my mother. Deji's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Miriam thought he might hit her. But then he stepped back, his lips curling into a cruel smile. You're bold, he said, his tone mocking. I'll give you that. But let me make one thing clear. You don't belong here, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you leave. With that, he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Miriam stood there for a long moment, her hands shaking. She wanted to cry, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she took a deep breath and went back to polishing the silver, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let him scare her away. Later that day, Adilu called Miriam to his study. When she arrived, he was sitting behind his desk, his face grave. The DNA test results were on the table in front of him. Sit down, Miriam, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. She sat, her heart pounding. The air felt thick, and she could barely breathe. Adilu picked up the envelope and opened it slowly. He glanced at the paper inside, his expression unreadable. Then he set it down and looked at her. It's confirmed, he said simply. You're my daughter. Miriam's chest tightened, and tears filled her eyes. She didn't know whether to feel relief or sadness. For years, she had wondered about her father, and now she had the answer. But it didn't erase the pain of everything her mother had gone through. Thank you, she said softly, her voice trembling. Adilu nodded, his expression somber. I owe you more than just answers, he said. I owe you an apology. I failed your mother and I failed you. I can't change the past, but I want to make things right. Before Miriam could respond, the door burst open, and Madame Folake stormed in. Her face was red with fury, and her eyes were blazing. What is this nonsense? She demanded, pointing at the test results on the desk. You're just going to accept this? You're just going to let her walk into our lives and ruin everything? Folake, calm down, Adilu said, his tone firm but tired. Calm down, Folake repeated, her voice rising. This girl is destroying us, and you're letting her. She's not destroying anything, Adilu said sharply. She's my daughter, and she deserves to be treated with respect. Folake let out a bitter laugh. Respect? For what? For being the product of your betrayal? For coming here and turning our lives upside down? That's enough. Adilu's voice thundered through the room, silencing Folake. He stood up, his eyes blazing. I won't let you speak about her like that. This isn't her fault. If you want to blame someone, blame me. Folake stared at him, her mouth open in shock. Then she turned on Miriam, her face twisted with rage. You think you've won, don't you? She hissed. You think you've taken my family, my husband? Well, let me tell you something, you'll never be part of this family. Never. Miriam felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She stood up, her hands clenched into fists. I'm not trying to take anything from you, she said, her voice steady despite the pain in her chest. I didn't come here to hurt anyone. All I wanted was the truth. And now you have it, Folake spat. So get out. Folake, Adilu said warningly, but Miriam shook her head. It's okay, she said quietly. She turned to Adilu, her eyes filled with tears. Thank you for giving me the truth. But maybe it's better if I leave. Adilu's face softened, and he reached out to her. Miriam, wait. But she was already walking toward the door. She couldn't stay here, not when every moment felt like a battle. She needed to find peace, even if it meant leaving the answers she had fought so hard to get behind. Miriam returned to her small room and began packing her things. As she folded her clothes, tears streamed down her face. She had found her father, but it felt like she had lost so much more. A soft knock on the door made her pause. She turned to see Adilu standing in the doorway, his expression pained. Don't go, he said softly. Please. Miriam shook her head, wiping her tears. I don't belong here, she said. Your family doesn't want me. They're wrong, Adilu said firmly. You're my family too, Miriam, and I'm not going to let you go. She looked at him, her heart aching. What about Madame Folake? Uncle Deji? They hate me. They'll come around, Adilu said. And if they don't, that's their problem. You've been through enough, Miriam. You don't have to fight this alone anymore. For the first time, Miriam felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a place in this family. It wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't ready to give up yet. She set her bag down and nodded slowly. Okay, she said. I'll stay. Adilu smiled, and for the first time, Miriam felt like she wasn't alone. The road ahead would be difficult, but at least she had someone to walk it with. Miriam stayed, but the tension in the house was thicker than ever. Madame Folake avoided her completely, and when they crossed paths, Folake's icy glares made it clear how she felt. Uncle Deji seemed to be everywhere, watching her like a hawk. And though Adilu tried to make her feel welcome, Miriam couldn't shake the feeling that she was an outsider. But she wasn't leaving. Not now. One evening, Miriam was helping Martha prepare dinner when Adilu walked into the kitchen. The staff quickly scattered, leaving Miriam alone with him. He glanced around awkwardly before speaking. Miriam, I need to talk to you, he said. She wiped her hands on a towel and turned to face him. Yes, sir. Not here, he said, gesturing for her to follow him. She hesitated but obeyed, her heart pounding as she followed him to the study. Once they were inside, Adilu closed the door and leaned against the desk, looking at her intently. I've been thinking a lot about everything, he began, his voice heavy. About your mother, about you, about all the mistakes I've made. Miriam stayed silent, unsure of what to say. I want to make it right, he said. I know I can't fix the past, but I want to try. I want to help you, support you, and make sure you have everything you need. Miriam looked down at her hands. You don't owe me anything, she said quietly. I didn't come here for your money or your help. I know, he said, and that's what makes me want to do it even more. You didn't ask for any of this, and yet here you are, dealing with all the chaos I brought into your life. Miriam's throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to let him in, to trust him, but another part of her was still scared. What about Madame Folake? She asked softly. She doesn't want me here. Adilu sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Folake is complicated, he admitted, but she'll come around. She's just upset. This is a lot for her to process. Miriam shook her head. I don't think she'll ever forgive me. Adilu stepped closer, his expression serious. It's not your fault, Miriam. None of this is. And if she can't see that, then that's on her, not you. Tears pricked Miriam's eyes, but she blinked them away. Thank you, she said softly. Adilu nodded. You're my daughter, he said. That means something to me. The next morning, Adilu surprised everyone by insisting that Miriam join him for breakfast in the main dining room. When Miriam entered, the tension was immediate. Madame Folake was already seated, her lips pressed into a thin line. Uncle Deji sat across from her, his eyes narrowing as Miriam approached. Good morning, Adilu said cheerfully, ignoring the icy atmosphere. Miriam, sit here. Miriam hesitated, glancing at Folake, but she obeyed, taking the seat next to Adilu. The silence was deafening as the staff brought in the food. So Adilu said, breaking the quiet, I've been thinking about how we can move forward as a family. A family? Folake snapped, her voice sharp. Is that what you're calling this? Adilu frowned. Folake, please, let's be civil. Civil? She repeated, her voice rising. You've turned this house into a circus, and now you want us to pretend like everything is fine? I'm trying to make things right, Adilu said firmly. For Miriam, for everyone, for her, Folake spat, glaring at Miriam. Everything is always about her now. Miriam's chest tightened, but she kept her head down. She didn't want to make things worse. I'm not going to apologize for wanting to support my daughter, Adilu said. And I won't let anyone treat her like she doesn't belong here. She doesn't belong here, Folake said coldly. And no matter how hard you try, she never will. Adilu's expression darkened. That's enough, he said, his voice low but firm. This is my house, and I will not tolerate this behavior. If you can't accept Miriam, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong. Folake's eyes widened, and for a moment, She looked like she might cry, but instead, she stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I won't stay here and be insulted," she said, storming out of the room. The silence that followed was suffocating. Miriam stared at her plate, her appetite completely gone. Uncle Deji cleared his throat and stood as well. "I think I've had enough excitement for one morning," he said coolly before leaving. Adilu sighed heavily and looked at Miriam. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "This isn't how I wanted things to go." "It's not your fault," Miriam said, her voice trembling. "Maybe I should leave." "You're not going anywhere," Adilu said firmly. "We'll get through this. Promise." The days that followed were difficult. Madame Folake barely spoke to anyone, and when she did, her words were sharp and cold. Uncle Deji seemed to enjoy stirring the pot, dropping sly comments and fueling the tension in the house. But Adilu didn't waver. He made an effort to include Miriam in family activities, even when it caused conflict. He also began asking about her dreams and goals, encouraging her to think about her future. One evening, as they sat in the study, Adilu asked Miriam about her plans. "What do you want to do with your life?" he asked. Miriam hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've always wanted to help people, maybe become a teacher. But I don't know if that's possible." "Of course it's possible," Adilu said. "If that's what you want, I'll support you." Miriam looked at him, surprised. "You mean it?" "Absolutely," he said. "You've been through so much, but you're strong. I want to help you achieve your dreams." For the first time in a long while, Miriam felt hope. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew she wasn't alone anymore. While things between Miriam and Adilu began to improve, the tension with Folake reached a breaking point. One evening, Miriam overheard a heated argument between Folake and Adilu in the living room. "I can't do this anymore, Adilu," Folake said, her voice trembling. "She's tearing this family apart." "No," Adilu said firmly. "You're tearing it apart with your refusal to accept her." "I'm supposed to accept that you have another child? That you betrayed me and expect me to just live with it?" "I didn't betray you," Adilu said, his voice rising. "This happened long before we met. You're punishing Miriam for something she had no control over." "And what about me?" Folake shouted. "What about my feelings? Don't I matter?" "Of course you matter," Adilu said. "But this isn't about you or me. It's about doing the right thing." "The right thing?" Folake laughed bitterly. "The right thing would have been to send her away." Adilu's voice dropped, but the anger in his tone was clear. "If that's how you feel, then maybe you're the one who should leave." Miriam's heart ached as she listened. She didn't want to be the cause of so much pain, but she also knew she couldn't leave. She had fought too hard for the truth, and she wasn't going to walk away now. The argument ended with Folake storming out of the house, leaving Adilu and Miriam alone in the living room. Adilu looked tired, but when he saw Miriam, he gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll get through this." Miriam nodded, though she wasn't sure if she believed him. But as she sat beside him, she realized that for the first time, she felt like she had a place in this family. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it was a start. And that was enough for now. Miriam sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the small window as the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains. The house felt different now. Quiet. Not the suffocating kind of quiet it had been after Madame Folake left, but a quieter, more thoughtful kind. It was like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to change. And then it did. She heard the front door open and the familiar clacking of high heels on the tiled floor. Miriam's heart skipped. She knew that sound. Slowly, she stood and crept toward her door, peeking out into the hallway. Madame Folake was back. Folake stood in the foyer, her suitcase beside her, and Adilu was rushing toward her like a man who had just been given a second chance. His face was a mixture of relief and hesitation as he stopped in front of her. "Folake," he said softly, "you came back." "I didn't come back for you," Folake said sharply, her voice steady but not cruel. "I came back because this is my home." Adilu's shoulders sagged a little, but he nodded. "I'm glad you're here. We've missed you." "We?" Folake said, raising an eyebrow. Or just you? Adielu hesitated. We, he said firmly, glancing toward the hallway where Miriam was hiding. All of us. Miriam stepped back, unsure if she should go out or stay hidden. Before she could decide, she heard footsteps heading her way. It was Adielu. Miriam, he said gently, come. She's back. Her stomach twisted, but she nodded. She followed him back to the foyer, where Folake stood with her arms crossed. Her gaze landed on Miriam, and for a moment, her expression hardened, but then it softened, just slightly. Good evening, Ma, Miriam said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Folake let out a soft sigh. You don't have to call me Ma, she said. You're not a maid anymore, are you? Miriam blinked, unsure how to respond. Was that an olive branch? Or a warning? I'm glad you're here, Miriam said after a pause. I hope we can find a way to make this work. Folake's eyes narrowed slightly, but then she nodded. We'll see, she said. It won't be easy. Adielu cleared his throat, stepping between them. What matters is that we're all here, he said. We'll figure it out together. Folake didn't respond, but she didn't argue either. Instead, she picked up her suitcase and headed upstairs. Adielu turned to Miriam and gave her a small smile. She's trying, he said. That's a good start. Miriam nodded, though her chest still felt tight. She wasn't sure if trying would be enough, but for now it was all they had. Over the next few days, the house slowly began to feel more like a home. Folake kept her distance from Miriam at first, but she wasn't as openly hostile as before. Instead of sharp comments, there were small nods and quiet exchanges, little gestures that showed she was at least willing to coexist. One evening, as Miriam was reading in the sitting room, Folake entered. Miriam immediately stood, unsure of what to do. Folake raised a hand, motioning for her to sit. You don't have to leave, Folake said, her voice even. Miriam nodded and sat back down, clutching the book in her lap. Folake sat across from her, crossing her legs and smoothing her skirt. I've been thinking, Folake began after a long pause. About everything. About you. Miriam's hands tightened on the book. What about me? You've turned my life upside down, Folake said, her tone blunt. But maybe it wasn't all your fault. Miriam blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. What do you mean? Folake sighed and leaned back in her chair. I've been angry, Miriam. Angry at Adielu, at myself, and at you. But the truth is, none of this was your choice. You didn't ask for any of this. No, ma'am, Miriam said softly. I didn't. I've been unfair to you, Folake admitted, her voice quieter now. And I'm sorry for that. Miriam's eyes widened. She hadn't expected an apology, especially not from Folake. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling. That means a lot to me. Folake nodded, her expression unreadable. It doesn't mean we'll be best friends, she said, but maybe we can find a way to live together. For Adielu's sake. And for yours. Miriam smiled, a small but genuine smile. I'd like that, she said. The turning point came a week later, during the scholarship launch event. Adielu had organized a small ceremony to announce the Saad Memorial Scholarship, and he insisted that both Folake and Miriam attend. Miriam stood nervously at the edge of the crowd, watching as guests mingled and chatted. She felt out of place among the well-dressed elites, but Adielu stayed close, introducing her to people and making her feel welcome. When it was time for the speeches, Adielu took the stage. He spoke about Saad, about her strength and kindness, and about the scholarship's mission to help young women like her. Miriam felt tears in her eyes as she listened, overwhelmed by the thought that her mother's legacy would live on. After the speech, Adielu called Miriam to the stage. Her heart pounded as she walked up, unsure of what to say. This scholarship wouldn't exist without Miriam, Adielu said, placing a hand on her shoulder. She reminded me of the importance of taking responsibility, of doing what's right. I'm proud to call her my daughter. The crowd applauded, and Miriam blinked back tears. She glanced toward the audience and saw Folake watching her, her expression soft. It was the first time Miriam truly believed they might be able to heal. That night, Back at the mansion, the family sat together for dinner. There was no tension, no sharp words or glares. It was quiet, but in a peaceful way. As they ate, Adilu turned to Miriam. "What's next for you?" he asked. "Have you thought about school?" Miriam nodded. "I want to study education," she said. "I want to become a teacher." Folake surprised everyone by speaking up. "That's a good choice," she said. "We need more teachers who care." Miriam smiled at her, grateful for the support. "Thank you," she said. As the conversation continued, Miriam felt a sense of belonging she hadn't felt before. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done, but for the first time, she felt like part of a family, and that was enough.